In this session, we'll talk about the generalizability of research. Generalizability is the degree to which you can apply the results of your study to a broader context. Broadly speaking, research results can be considered generalizable when the findings can be applied to most people, most contexts, most of the time. To understand psychological constructs, we typically study a sample of participants. So the sample refers to the participants in the study. And the population is a set of individuals with the particular characteristics under investigation. To be able to apply or generalize the study conclusion to a wider population, the sample should resemble the broader population. Good generalizability would mean that a study's results apply to many different types of people or different situations. Poor generalizability means that the study's results can only be applied to a subgroup of the population or in a very specific situation. Overgeneralizing from a narrow sample can be very misleading. For example, study finds that 90% of British children support Manchester United. In this case, it would be very important to consider where the data was collected. Another example, a study might find that 100% of French people have internet access. However, if you collected this data in an online study, then the finding might essentially be meaningless because it tells us nothing about the people who don't have internet access. Or a claim like gender equality has been achieved in higher education based on the experiences of female professors who have achieved this high level of success within this context would not tell us anything about the people who may not have made it to that level due to discrimination. When you're assessing the generalizability of a research paper, one of the first things you might want to ask is whether the sample is appropriate for the research question. If you are studying a psychological construct that is believed to be universal, your population would be humans everywhere. If you are studying people with a specific characteristic or condition, such as bilingual people or people who have been diagnosed with depression, your population would be people with that specific characteristic or condition. So generalizability is about whether the sample is representative of the specific population. So this includes thinking about the gender, age, race of participants, and so on. And in the case where you're focusing on a specific characteristic, you might also think about different types of bilingual experiences, for example. It's worth keeping in mind that there's typically a trade-off between representing people from different backgrounds and life stages and reducing noise and confounds in your study. So for example, memory ability changes across the human lifespan. So while including participants of all ages, so that might be children and older adults, would increase the generalizability, it would also potentially introduce a lot of confounds and a lot of noise into your data. Next, when you're assessing generalizability in research, you can ask whether the sample is problematically narrow. The white Western individualist bias refers to the overrepresentation of participants from these backgrounds in published research. Top psychology journals in the 2000s were found to have this kind of overrepresentation, such that 96% of the participants came from countries with only 12% of the world's population. These studies suffer from poor generalizability due to this very limited focus. And increasing sample diversity could help researchers develop theories of human nature that reliably explain human behavior across countries and cultures instead of theories that are developed based on only a thin slice of humanity. And this is a good further reading on this topic if you're interested. This is a good resource related to publication bias, and I'll summarize some of the key findings here. So it has been found that studies with predominantly Black, Indigenous, and people of color samples are often required to indicate their sample in the title and to justify their sample and to discuss the limitations of the study's generalizability. And it has also been found that reviewers are more likely to require that papers with BIPOC samples include a white comparison group to be published. And these practices can perpetuate the problematic belief that whiteness is the norm by which all others must be compared, and they create additional burdens and barriers to publish research, including these samples. Roberts and colleagues provided some suggestions to help researchers improve generalizability. So first, they suggested that researchers should detail the racial demographics of samples to make it clear to the reader who was included and who was not. And they also suggested that researchers should justify the racial demographics of their samples and include explicit generality statements as well as positionality statements. So that includes explaining your own background as a researcher and how it might relate to the research that you're conducting. Next, we'll talk about some sampling biases that can reduce generalizability. The key question that we want to explore here is whether there are systematic differences between people who participated in a research study and the people who did not participate. So we'll talk about a few different forms of sampling biases, including undercoverage bias, non-response bias, self-selection bias, attrition bias, and survivorship bias. Undercoverage bias occurs when a part of the population is excluded from your sample. So as a result, the sample is no longer representative of the target population. As an example, consider someone who's conducting research about PhD researchers' workload. And they're doing this by handing out a survey during the PhD researcher's weekly social event at a specific university or in a specific department. Because of this sampling method, individuals who might work remotely or might work part-time or who have other responsibilities at that time, for example, teaching, or they might be attending a seminar, or who don't want to attend these social events for whatever reason, are less likely to be included in the sample. Non-response bias happens when people who are unwilling or unable to take part in a research study are different from those who do. So if we are exploring PhD researchers' workload by inviting them to participate in 2-hour-long focus groups, it might be that the PhD researchers with the heaviest workload are less likely to join the focus group because they simply don't have time. So this could then lead to a biased sample if those who are most likely to attend your focus groups are the ones with the least busy schedule. And if this is the case, the reported workloads in your sample might be lower than those in the general PhD population. Relatedly, self-selection bias refers to the bias that occurs when individuals are allowed to choose whether they want to participate in a research study or not, and when participants differ from non-participants in ways that are significant to the research. That means that self-selection bias can affect the generalizability of your results. And this can be exacerbated by pre-screening or advertising procedures. So for example, the PhD researchers who are the most unhappy with their workload might be more interested in participating in your research. And if you frame this as an opportunity to vent about your workload, you might potentially exacerbate this bias. Attrition bias is the selective dropout of some participants who systematically differ from those who remain in the study. So for example, if you have a study where participants in one group need to complete a 15-minute meditation every day for a month, for example, and participants in the other group need to go for a 15-minute walk every day, it could be the case that participants in the meditation condition who experience particularly high levels of stress or anxiety might be more likely to drop out if meditation is a lot more challenging for them, or they might be less likely to drop out if the meditation is perceived as more beneficial. And if this was the case, your comparisons of anxiety or stress levels in the final sample might be biased because participants who scored particularly highly on either of those might be less likely to still be part of the study at this final stage if they were assigned to the meditation group, whereas if they were in the walk group, they might still remain in the study. Survivorship bias occurs when a dataset only considers existing or surviving observations and fails to consider observations that have ceased to exist. If you're focusing on a subset of your sample or population that has already passed some sort of selection process, this increases your chances of drawing incorrect conclusions. For example, if you ask only final year PhD researchers about their experiences of a toxic work environment during their PhD, it might be the case that people with negative experiences have already left, so they would be underrepresented in your sample. This brings us to a bit of a catch-22 in the sense that typically we don't know whether the results would be different for people who did not participate or did not complete the study because we do not have their data. So we might try to assess the potential impact of sampling bias by comparing the sample characteristics to the characteristics of the general population. So as a basic example, we might look at the gender ratios in our sample and compare it to the ratios in the general population. We might be able to conclude that there was a bias, such that, for example, maybe more male participants signed up to the study than there are male participants in the general population. And we could also compare the demographics and/or the initial performance of participants who dropped out from the study and participants who completed it to see if there are any systematic differences. And of course, we can only do this if we did collect data on these measures and the dropouts did complete those initial measures. In this final section, we'll talk about how to apply what you've learned about generalizability so far to critically analyze research papers. So we can think of a few different levels of generalizability. So on the general level, we have this idea that everyone should be represented. And this is a very important principle, and it's a problem with science in general. But this is often less convincing as a criticism for a given study, unless the authors are overstating the generalizability of their findings. It's not quite realistic to say that every single study should include people from every country in the world, for example. And thinking about generalizability more specifically, we would assess the sample's representativeness in relation to the studied variables. For example, are the people in your sample likely to score lower or higher than the general population would on these measures? And this is especially important if the overall scores are part of the key finding. So maybe if you're looking at the prevalence of something, so if the finding is 20% of people have poor self-esteem, then it's obviously important that the sample is generalizable to the wider population. And if you can be even more specific, you can think about whether the observed relationship between the variables in the study would exist in other samples or in the general population. So would the effect of the intervention in the study, or the manipulation, generalize to the wider population? And this is obviously very important to know before research findings are applied more broadly. So how can you assess the generalizability of the relationship between variables? So we'll go through a few different steps. So the first step would be to assess the key variables in relation to the sample, and then to consider theoretical and operational differences. And then it is useful to cite some evidence or explain your reasoning. And then you need to explain how the key finding of the specific study might be affected by these issues with generalizability of the sample. And then finally, it is very helpful to try to suggest some improvements as well. So the first step, assess the key variables in relation to the sample. You need to consider whether there is a reason to suspect that the particular characteristics of the people in your sample would make them interact differently with either the independent or the dependent variable than the target population would. Because if that is the case, the result might not generalize to the wider population or the target population. So here you might want to consider different characteristics of your sample. So you might think about the age, education, nationality, race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, career, caring responsibilities, etc. So these are just a few examples. And you might not always have all this information, but it depends on the specific study, what you can find, what you can infer about the sample based on what the authors have reported. And then you need to think about whether any of these characteristics might influence participants' familiarity with the environment in which the study is conducted, the tasks or the materials that they're exposed to in the study, their stress levels, their motivations to participate, their language ability, their values or preferences, their perception of the study's purpose or importance, how much they trust the researcher, etc. So again, these are just a couple of examples that you can think about. And crucially, would the characteristics of the participants influence any of these things in a way that would influence how they interact with what is measured in the study? And you can also think about this in relation to the theoretical and operational levels of what is measured. So as an example of all of this, if we are interested in generosity, the theoretical level might be trait generosity. And we might suspect that this might differ between people with different financial circumstances, for example. And at the operational level, we might measure trait generosity by looking at charitable donations. So this could also differ between groups of people, perhaps if they hold different beliefs regarding the efficiency of charities. So here, in this second situation, the theoretical generosity might not actually differ between the groups, but the group differences might be a procedural confound due to the specific operationalization of the construct. So, in other words, because researchers decided to measure generosity through charitable donations, this might introduce this confound. And then the next step is to make sure that your claims are supported by evidence. And make sure that you don't present sort of far-fetched suggestions just for the sake of being critical. And also be careful not to perpetuate stereotypes by saying that, you know, these people in this group are not as good at this, or they are more likely to hold this belief. Obviously, that wouldn't be a good critical reflection point. And also be careful that you don't overstate the importance of your own suggestions. So keep in mind that if it wasn't measured in the study, you can't really be sure that it played a role. You can suggest it, but just be careful not to overstate it and say that this is definitely the case and the whole study is unreliable because of my suggestion. And when possible, support your claims with evidence. So the point before, suggesting that perhaps generosity levels would differ depending on the participant's socioeconomic background. So if you have a thought like that, maybe you think, maybe actually there's a reason to believe that this sample might interact with this key variable in this way, it is a very good idea to look for some evidence to see if this idea is actually supported by evidence, right? So here, for example, this study seem like they have explored this, the influence of social class on pro-social behavior. So that's a good idea to do some reading. And so looking at this study in more detail, we can see that it does report differences in generosity and charitableness between lower and higher socioeconomic status individuals. So this is helpful because it can give us an idea of the direction of this effect in this case, and also it is useful to support our suggestion that there might be some differences. It's not something that we just had a hunch about. It's something that is actually that has actually been shown in research studies. And there might be some situations where you can't find any evidence. So in those cases, I would recommend that you make an effort to really explain the reasoning behind your argument. For example, if you want to suggest that people who participate in research studies might be more altruistic than those who do not, this is always a bit of a judgment call, but it never hurts to explain your reasoning. So in this situation, we generally know very little about people who don't participate in research studies, so this would be quite hard to back up with evidence, presumably. So then, to explain your reasoning, you might say that it's possible that the people who agreed to participate tended to be more altruistic than members of the general population, because the time commitment of participating in the study was quite extensive. So if you can point out that this was a really long study and participants did not receive any compensation, or whatever the details were, this would be more convincing to the reader, and they would understand, yes, this seems like it might attract people who are more altruistic. So whenever you can, try to explain your reasoning instead of simply making a claim about, for example, people who don't participate. Then you want to explain how the key finding might be affected. So sticking with this example, you might say that trait generosity might vary between people from different socioeconomic backgrounds and include this reference that you found for your independent reading. So in the first scenario, there might be a study where the key finding is about the overall donation rates. Maybe the finding is only 5% of people are willing to donate when no one is watching them, for example. So think about the specific sample. So maybe if the study was conducted at an expensive private university, you might think that the sample would be people with higher socioeconomic status than the general population. Again, it would be useful to actually do some research on that and provide a reference. But if that is the case, you might suggest that overall generosity levels in this sample might be lower than they would be in the general population. In the second scenario, it might be that participants were randomly assigned to different conditions within the study. So there was an experimental manipulation. While the sample may have lower overall generosity than the wider population, that is actually unlikely to differ systematically between the conditions. So here, this critical reflection point is less important to the actual finding. Instead, you might want to assess the manipulation and think about whether there's any reason to think that people with different generosity levels would respond differently to whatever this manipulation was. And if that is the case, that would be a good critical reflection, because it might mean that the study's key result wouldn't generalize in a different population. And as a third scenario, a study might have compared two different groups, and the groups might differ in socioeconomic status. So for example, if we imagine they were comparing students who were doing different degree programs, and you might suspect that there might be differences in socioeconomic status and therefore potentially in generosity between those two groups. And again, if you are making a claim about students' socioeconomic status in different degree programs, it would be useful to provide a reference showing that there are potentially differences, or make sure you explain your reasoning. So if that is the case, socioeconomic status could be a confound, and it would mean that the relationship between the variables may not generalize. And the final step would be to try to suggest some improvements. So you can suggest that to ensure generalizability of the findings of the study to a wider population, future studies might recruit a community sample. So instead of using only students at the university, or they might ask participants about their socioeconomic background to try to statistically assess potential differences between groups or compare it to the wider population. So these are just some suggestions, and always make sure that you try to explain how or why your suggestion would help reduce the specific problem that you have identified. To sum up, so how to use all of this in your critical evaluation. So first, you can think about whether the participant sample is appropriate for the research question. Then you can assess whether the participant sample is problematically narrow. So here you can think about white Western individualist bias, and also consider whether the authors are overstating the generalizability of their results. And then think about whether it seems like there might have been a bias in who ended up participating or completing this study. So are certain people more likely to sign up and complete this study in a way that might systematically affect the outcome? And finally, is there a reason to suspect that particular characteristics of the sample may lead them to interact differently with the dependent or independent variables in a way that means that the result might not generalize to the wider population?